Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lauseneziris, and this is my YouTube channel grecochess. And we're continuing the series of presenting games suggested to me by my Facebook chess friends. This is the 7th video of the series. Until now, I have 7 games recommended to me by my Facebook friends. A few more have told me that when they have some time in the future, they'll recommend some additional games. I can wait until then, there is no hurry. Today we're going to present the 7th game. My Facebook friend that suggested it is another one of my Greek compatriots, Grandmaster Dimitris Alexakis. Dimitris is the latest Greek chess player to become a Grandmaster very recently. And Dimitris, congratulations and my best wishes for a successful chess career as a Grandmaster. His opponent was Milos Ratkovic from Serbia. The game took place just 2 months ago in July 2025 at the beautiful island of Rhodes. Rhodes is the largest of the Dodecanese islands situated at the southeast corner of Greece. There was a tournament that took place last July where Alexakis faced Ratkovic. In fact, there were 2 Serbian players called Ratkovic. Alexakis faced Milos Ratkovic. And when they played, Milos's rating was 2489 versus 2537 for Alexakis. Alexakis therefore had a little better odds since his rating was higher. We're going now to the chess.com board to see what happened. And here we are. As always, on the left half, you are going to see the chessboard, and on the right half, you're going to see the computer evaluation with positive number meaning white is better and negative meaning that black is better. And computer will also say whether the move played was the best or not, which could have been the best move, and what are the best 3 moves for the other side. And Ratkovic starts with the d pawn going to d4. Alexakis replies with what's called the Indian defense, knight goes to f6. Knight goes to f3 for Ratkovic, pawn to c5 for Alexakis. And you may be wondering, why did Alexakis sacrifice his pawn? In fact, taking the pawn is not even one of the 3 best moves for white. What is the secret? Well, in the beginning, you want to control your center, and you don't want your central pawns to go out of the center, because if white takes the pawn at c5, black will eventually take it back, but black will have stronger control of the center. This is not a decisive factor yet, but it is an unnecessary advantage for black. That is why, instead of taking the pawn at c5, Ratkovic defends his pawn on d4 by moving his pawn from c2 to c3. Pawn to d5 for Alexakis. Now Ratkovic will take the pawn at c5. Why now? Because the pawn at c3 is defending the square at d4. And this is the end of the book theory. Alexakis will play a move that is not part of the book theory, but it is the best according to the computer. Pawn goes to e6. Ratkovic will defend his pawn on c5 by sending his bishop on e3. You see what's happening? Yes, the pawn is defended. Otherwise, the bishop on f8 would take the pawn. But now, by defending this pawn, look what Ratkovic did. His pawn on his bishop on e3 is blocking the pawns on e2, which is blocking the bishop on f1. Ratkovic will need quite a few moves to free his position. Pawn goes to a5 for Alexakis, and by doing so, he stops Ratkovic from moving his pawn to b4. This is why Ratkovic will take his pawn to c4 now. And Alexakis develops the other knight, goes to c6. Knight to c3 for Ratkovic. Till now, players are developing their pieces. And usually they say don't move the same piece twice in the opening, but Alexakis saw something and he puts his knight on g4. What did he see? If he can change the bishop at e3, then Ratkovic takes back with the f2 pawn, and the pawns at e2 and d3 will block the position of white. Not easy to castle, not easy to develop the bishop, and so on. Ratkovic sends his bishop to g5, starting to liberate his position and attacking the black queen. Alexakis replies, the pawn going to f6. Bishop has to move again to h4. And now Alexakis sends his pawn to d4. Knight has to move for white, goes to e4, and Alexakis pushes his pawn to e5. Inaccuracy, says the computer, but okay, at the end of the 10 moves, you see that the two players are almost equal, just 0.05, very small advantage for black. Black created what's called a pawn chain, a quite long one going from g7, s6, e5, and d4. If you can keep the chain, it can be very strong, especially near the ending. Let's see how players are doing. White has an extra pawn, as we mentioned, but it's a double pawn c4, c5. Black can not easily, but eventually take it. Currently, there's only the knight at e4 that protects the pawn at c5. King safety. Well, still the kings have not castled yet. Let's see what's going to happen. White sends a pawn to h3 to attack the knight. That goes back to h6. Pawn to g4. And white starts creating an attack on the king side. Knight to f7 for black. Pawn to e3 for white. Bishop to e7 for black. Rook to g1 for white. So white really wants to have an attack along the g file. Black is going to castle, which sends the king exactly opposite of the rook at g1. But I think there's a long way until this becomes dangerous. Pawn to a3 for Ratkovic. And pawn to f5 for Alexakis, that is threatening the knight at e4. Not only that, is also threatening the bishop at h4. If, for example, white moves the knight to save it, for example, to d2 or to g3, then bishop goes to h4, knight takes to h4, then queen takes h4, and black is a piece better. That is why white will first exchange the queens, and only then start thinking about the knight. Pawn goes to g5. Pawn goes from g4 to f5 for Ratkovic, and bishop goes to f5 for Alexakis. Now the knight at e4 is once again threatened, and Ratkovic will protect it by sending the bishop to d3. Exchange of pawns at e3 now at this point, and exchange at e4. And black takes the pawn back. The black queen takes the pawn on c5. No protection any longer. And after the 20 moves, see how things are going. The computer gives a relatively small advantage for white, 0.62. Materially, both sides have queen, rook, two light pieces, and 5 pawns. Light pieces, we mean, of course, the bishops or the knights. And we call them light because both are worth 3 pawns. I will continue the game after the first 20 moves. The pawn at d3 is threatened for white. That's why white will save it with the queen on e2. Rook goes to d8 for black. The black rook occupies the open d file. Bishop to d5 for white, trying to block the d file, but black will play an unexpected move. Rook takes bishop, which the computer says it's a brilliant because black will sacrifice the exchange, and who knows what black is going to gain. We'll see this later. Pawn goes to d5 for white. Black sends the pawn to e4 because now white was threatening the knight at c6. And black replies danger 11 by threatening the knight at f3. White saves the knight, sending it to d2, but black decides not to save the knight on c6 and instead sends the other rook, the f7 rook, to e5. The computer says it is a brilliant move and not easy to see it. Hopefully we'll see why. White is going to take the rook on c6, and now white is a whole, takes the knight at c6, and now white is a whole rook ahead. And black checks with the knight on d3. We finished 25 moves at this point. The computer says that both sides are equal, even though white has an extra rook. King to d1 for white. Knight takes pawn at b2, checks again, king to e1. Knight goes to d3. Check. This looks a little bit like the position 2 moves ago, but now the pawn at b2 is not there any longer. That's why this is not a repetition. But black can force a repetition by checking back and forth between b2 and d3, doing 3 times. It's a draw. Let's see what's going to happen. King goes to d1. And black decides not to go for the draw, try for something better, even though black is down a rook for a pawn. Black takes the pawn on c6, so black is down a rook for 2 pawns. The white queen goes to g2, and white threatens mate. If black is not careful, queen goes to g7, it's mate. But black will reply by sending the queen at c3. We finish move number 29. Computer says both sides are equal, although white has an extra rook for 2 pawns. The white rook on a1 is threatened. And the rook has only 3 squares to go, a2, b1, or c1. Computer says the best thing that white can do is take the pawn. It's not a mate because queen will take it, rook will take it, and the king takes rook, and black will be a pawn ahead if I'm correct. But that's not what Ratkovic wanted. He wanted to save the rook, and he sends to b1 and to threaten the pawn at b7. And computer says that this is a blunder, and Alexakis checks with his knight on f2. Computer says that Alexakis, black needs 9 moves for the mate, meaning under best defense for white, if black plays the best possible weight, in 9 moves, it's checkmate for black. Ratkovic resigned. We're going to see now the review of the game, and then we'll go back to this position to see the possible continuation. You see that white had 87.5% versus 94.4 for black. 94.4 is a great percentage, especially for a game that goes all the way to 30 moves. Ratings slightly lower for the players than the real ones. For Alexakis, very little, from 2537. The computer says he played as if his rating was 2500. For Ratkovic, a little bit more below, from 2489. Computer says his performance was 2350. And let's see now the individual categories. 2 brilliant moves for Alexakis. As I mentioned in a previous video, even having 1 brilliant move is very rare, but 2 brilliant moves at the same game, Alexakis, that's great. Great moves, 3 versus 2 for Alexakis. Best, 14 versus 11 for Ratkovic. Excellent, 3 versus 2 for Alexakis. Good, 4 versus 1 for Alexakis. And book moves, 4 for Ratkovic, 3 for Alexakis. And let's go to the negative category. Inaccuracies, 3 versus 2 for Alexakis. No misses and 1 blunder for Ratkovic, and this was his last move. But now we'll go back to the last position to see why did Ratkovic resign, because it is not obvious. Ratkovic has a rook for 2 pawns. Materially, he's doing so much better. But we're going to set up the board again. First, we delete all the existing pieces, and now we are going to place one by one the pieces where they were before. King go to d1 for white, rook, queen goes to g2, rooks go to b1 and g1, and pawns go to a3, e3, and h3. For black, king goes to g8, queen goes to c3, rook goes to f8, knight goes to f2. For white, I forgot, we also have a knight and d2. Yes, for white, yes. And now the black pawns. a6, b7, e4, g7, and h7. We're going to load the position. And let's see what would happen. Out of these 3 variations, we're only going to see the strongest for white. Queen goes to f2. Rook goes to f2. So you see now that materially black now is better, because black had to sacrifice the queen to end the game. See the mating threat. The mating threat is an e2, and white cannot defend. So now for now here, it is obvious that after white exhausted your checks, set his rooks on g7, and queen takes it. It is obvious now why the case for black is hopeless. Let's go back. Would white have done anything better? Because here, if you take it, yes, you lose your queen. What would happen if king went to e2? Queen goes to d3 check. King to e1. King to e3 check. King to f1. Knight to d3. It's a discover check from the rook. Knight to f3. Rook to f3. And it's made. What other choices did white have? White has only 3 legal moves. The one is a queen takes the knight. We did it. We did the king goes to e2. Let's see what would happen if king went to e1. King to e3, king to f1, knight to d3, rook to f. Yes, and you see, sorry, we jumped a move. Knight to f3, yes. Rook goes to f3, rook to 2, and rook to f2 mate. So clearly, either white would have to suffer mate in very few moves, or first sacrifice the queen and still have made a few moves down the road. This concludes my coverage of this win by Dimitris Alexakis that helped him become Grandmaster. Once again, congratulations both for winning the game and for becoming Grandmaster. Unless we have any more of my Facebook friends submitting games, we'll continue with other things. As I mentioned before, I came back from Albany, where I participated in the New York State Championship. And there are a few other tournaments I'm going to participate. We'll see later what's going to happen. For now, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Thanks to the subscribers. Thanks to the people that like. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Harry Lausaniziris. This is Greco Chess. Goodbye.